You're listening to The Weather Junkies.
Oh boy. Large wedge tornado coming up into Tuscaloosa. A winter storm warning is in effect for our area.
So we can expect at least another 2 to 4 inches overnight. Then that snow is
The National Weather Service in Huntsville has issued a tornado warning for northwestern Minnesota.
14 to 22 inches of snow!
And welcome to another episode of The Weather Junkies. This is episode 51. I'm your host, Dakota Smith. Tyler is out tonight. He got hung up at work, but he might be joining us in the middle. So if you hear him pop in, it's just Tyler getting off work, joining the discussion. Tonight we have on Mark Jelinek from What Is It About the Weather? He has a podcast where he just has a nice fireside chat, and looking forward to talking to him. Before we get into weather in our backyards, I wanted to mention that we recently launched a Patron account where we ask for people to help us out with the cost of housing the podcast, our website, and our podcasting platform. And we love doing this. We love talking about the weather, and we're hoping to continue to do that. Just asking for a little help, especially we're hoping to increase the episodes of Weather Ready or Not. And those take a lot of time and more space on our podcasting host. So we're hoping to up those. So if you could help us out, if you have the kindness in your heart to do that, you can find it at Patreon. That's patreon.com/theweatherjunkies. And even if it's $1 a month, that makes all the difference in the world to helping us keep this show running. Okay, so weather in our backyard today. It was chilly. That's an understatement. I think we got to around -5 last night in the Fort Collins University station, and I was bundled up. The day before, we had a few inches, 3 to 5 inches, drop across the Front Range of Colorado, and then we had I guess they like to call it an Arctic front move through, and I got down.
Polar vortex?
There we go. Yeah, so we're joined by Mark tonight, and he is What Is It About the Weather? So Mark, you're in Atlanta. I'm assuming, and this is a tough assumption here. I'm assuming it's warmer there.
It has to be warmer than where you are, but we're going to head into the 20s tonight for the first time in I can't remember how long. We finally got some rain over the past week and a half or so. I guess stopped the drought from getting any worse and helped in a few places, but even some areas got 6 inches plus, but even still, it's just beginning to make a dent. We had almost 2 months. And actually, was 2 months at a couple locations with zero measurable precipitation. So it was quite a downer. And what was even weirder is there were like no clouds. I mean, it was just a strange couple of months. So have had the rain. And today, actually, I was up top looking around before the podcast around sunset, and was fortunate enough to be witness to a nice sunset and a hole punch cloud even thrown in. So
man, that's great.
Good all the way around today. So can't complain.
Yeah, that's great. And so before we get into the tweets, I just wanted to give Mark a little bit of his background. He has a master's degree in atmospheric science from Georgia Tech, and you're a tough guy to track down on the web. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the stuff you've been doing, and I guess maybe what you did for your master's, because that's always an interesting thing to talk about.
Sure. So, unlike a lot of people that get into weather, and while I had the weather bug early, of course, my career didn't start in the weather enterprise by any means. So, my going back to grad school occurred kind of after my early career, which was in the IT field, and we can always talk about that a little bit more later. So actually I did my undergrad at UGA, or University of Georgia. So anybody who knows SEC football or sports will know that being a Georgia grad and a Georgia Tech grad puts me in quite a bit of conflict with myself. And my master's thesis was in predicting snowpack and snowmelt behavior in the springtime, and trying to derive that on longer lead time. So looking at it months to seasons in advance. And since that time, I've done a few things, but a lot of it's been connected with Georgia Tech or coming out of Georgia Tech. So I remained at Georgia Tech and continued to do some research work, and also worked for a spin-off company that came out of Georgia Tech and run by a couple people well known in the kind of the atmospheric science world. Judith Curry and Peter Webster are the owners of that company, and left that about middle of this year, and started doing things like this podcast and some other things, and actually getting ready to start some new stuff here, hopefully at the beginning of the year. But all the I's and T's have not been dotted, so I don't want to get too much into that. But some new ventures starting around the first of the year. So touch a little bit everything. Yeah.
So we're going to have a nice long chat with Mark in a minute here. And Mark, feel free to chime in on these tweets tonight. But starting with our first tweet, it's from Yasser Kisk. I hope I'm saying that right. He's a TV meteorologist in Fort Waynes, Indiana, NBC. And he tweeted out, his tweet said, winter impact number of 1 today with some very light snow developing. And this is obviously for his viewing area. And the thing I wanted to talk about with this is that you see scales like this developed by local meteorologists. And I'm always curious how effective they are. And I think on the surface they're a good idea, and it gives people kind of some perspective of what to expect this time compared to the last time, and etc. But then if you have a whole bunch of different scales for one place, then that kind of muddles the message. So I guess I just wanted to bring this kind of topic and have a discussion about it. Mark, I was curious, what did you kind of think about this graphic here?
Yeah, kind of to your point, I think the idea of what it's conveying is good. And, there's always this discussion with, should the National Weather Service be the only one that has watches and warnings and those sort of things? But they forget a lot of times they're not the ones always communicating with the general public. And even when there are watches and warnings, so often the media are still the ones in the end that are doing that communication. And I think for something like this, where it's just conveying, sort of an inconvenience level, I think it's fine. And I actually don't even mind that it would be, different than another station in the area. I think where it would get tricky is if you start getting into what is a heavy impact number 4, and how people might interpret that word could be very different. And so I think it can get a little challenging when the terminology isn't something maybe they're used to with weather watches or warnings. So, again, I agree that the idea of conveying it simply, giving somebody a simple message to work from is a good idea, as long as they're not in too much of a conflict when it comes to a life-threatening situation, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we see that during severe weather outbreaks. The SPC has a Storm Prediction Center has their outlooks, whether it's during a high impact event. And local stations also have kind of, so at least some copy straight from Storm Prediction Center and put it on the airwaves, but others use their own metric. When there's already something in place by the National Weather Service, I'm speaking as a non-broadcast meteorologist, obviously, but I think you should probably just go ahead and use that if you think it's doing the justice to the event. I think with severe weather outbreaks, it's more of an issue, and there's more discrepancies between on air and the National Weather Service. So let's move on here to our next tweet from Becky Elliott. She helps us out with Weather Ready or Not episodes, and her tweet says, "This may be an obvious answer poll, but would you rather And the choices are go on an epic storm chase or fly into a hurricane. And to my surprise, go on an epic storm chase beat out fly into a hurricane by 2-1, actually. And from my perspective, maybe it's just because I've never flown into a hurricane, but I would much rather go into a hurricane just to say that I did it. I know I probably would get nauseous at the time, and it would be a pretty bumpy ride. But I think that's kind of like a one-in-a-lifetime thing to do, whereas storm chasing you can do, a couple times a year if you're in the right spot. And someone commented on here, there should be an option for pull an all-nighter with microwave popcorn in a blizzard. That would probably be my, even though flying in a hurricane is awesome, I love blizzards. So Mark, what would you answer here?
Yeah, I would vote for the blizzard, but I would stand outside in the blizzard as opposed to being inside. No, to your point about the hurricane, I guess my response would be, how much have you flown in your life? And I have, I've been in my travels, and we'll get into, some of me being in Atlanta and also being in Santiago, Chile, which I've done back and forth for the last 10 years, but flying through the ITCZ multiple times, I can tell you that I have no desire. While I agree with you, it's not a very often thing to fly into a hurricane. I have no desire to do that. So I think the epic storm chase can be fun in different ways. You also have the camaraderie and other things that go along with a storm chase.
Yeah.
I envision a hurricane. Yeah, I would probably do it if I was invited, and yes, I would probably vomit on the plane. But I also know that I would be gripping onto the seat the whole time, having been through a couple of flights where I was just happy to get on the ground, sort of thing.
Yeah, maybe if we could, I don't know, take a sleeping pill before and after the eye and just wake up in the eye. That would be the the way to get around all the turbulence. And I think turbulence is an understatement, because
yeah, for sure.
You see some of those videos and people can't really do anything.
Don't you think going out would be worse, because you got all the way to the eye and it calmed down and you were finally relaxed, and then all of a sudden you had to go through that all over again?
Yeah, that would be bad. So let's move on to our next tweet here. It's from a non-weather person. It's from Anthony De Rosa. He's a digital production manager for The Daily Show. And his tweet says, so it's concerning the Breitbart article and the response from the Weather Channel on the Breitbart climate change article. If you haven't read this, go ahead and give it a read, just so you're kind of familiar with the situation before we talk about it. But he summed up Breitbart's response, and it's probably summed up in a simple way that, they had more responses. But basically he said Breitbart's response was, "Shut up, you're just a pretty girl." And they do actually say pretty girl in the article. And the thing I want to talk about here is not so much the back and forth, but kind of the sexism in meteorology is a thing, and it's a thing in every industry, I'd say. But it comes up a lot in meteorology because there are a lot of on-air meteorologists who are women, and it's I don't know, it's just sad to see that kind of rhetoric. And that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if you have anything to say about this, Mark, but
yeah, actually, and this is this has kind of been a thing in this election season as well, and it's not the only case where I've seen unfortunate sexist thoughts about what women's roles are in this society. And having gone to school, I don't know if you know Angela Fritz over at the Capital Weather Gang. Yeah. And she's very vocal on this topic. And if you guys haven't had her on and want to talk about this, she would be a great person to do that. I'm glad that she's able to, she brings up the point. It's hard enough, right? And I think even the fact that there's a broadcast meteorology group specifically for women that's a private group where they deal with these issues, and they are very real. And it's unfortunate that in this day and age that still goes on, because a lot of women I know, including, again, one of the owners of the company I work for, are much smarter than many of the men I associate with every day, including my own wife, who is smarter than I am. it's just stunning to me that this still goes on and that women are still treated this way. I can understand that not all, there's nothing wrong with a mother who stays home and raises her kids. That's perfectly fine. But if a woman wants to be in the workplace, she should be treated as a person working in the workforce and judged by the quality of what she does, and sex should have nothing to do with it.
I think you summed that up very well. Completely agree with that. And on to our final tweet here. This tweet is from the National Weather Service in Kansas City, and their tweet says, "The next time you hear about a big winter storm over a week away, just think of everyone's favorite game on The Price is Right." And of course, that's Plinko, is what they're talking about. And they include a graphic here that I think does a good conceptual job on explaining the difficulty of forecasting inch amounts for a snowstorm. If you're not familiar with Plinko, basically there is a pegboard that you stand at the top of, and you have a little disc that you drop into the pegboard, and it bounces back and forth between the pegs, and it looks like it's going one direction, it ends up going another one, and eventually it lands up in a little bin. And on the show, that's the money you win. But with this, it's showing that's the forecast, or that's what actually happens. And as you get closer and closer to the bottom, that's you getting closer to the actual event compared to the forecast. And they have a whole bunch of lines of text here talking about predictability and how it increases as we're getting closer to the event. So it's nice to see graphics like this, and hopefully we continue to see these kind of graphics from the National Weather Service.
I think the graphics are great for people like us. I wonder if it gets lost on the general public, though. It's very involved.
There's a lot of text here.
Yeah, I think the answer is, did you hear about that snow forecast next week? See me next week, and I'll let you know what the forecast really is, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I have to take exception that Plinko is not the most favorite game on Price is Right. It has to be Cliffhanger. I mean,
yeah, actually.
That's just a staple. I mean, Price is Right, when I was watching it, long before you were born, I was watching Price is Right, and I think Cliffhanger was the game to watch.
That's the one where they have to explain that one. I think I know what you're talking about.
You have to guess close to what the price really is, and so I don't remember the final number. Let's say he has to go up $30 or whatever it is, and so if you're off by he goes off, and eventually he falls off the cliff, which you should appreciate being in Colorado. If you don't guess close enough to the actual price is what.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, Plinko, it isn't. You're right. It isn't my favorite Price is Right game either. But yeah. Anyways, I like to see the National Service do kind of unique things like that, and maybe it got across to a few people, maybe not.
I think it maybe serves better in like a Facebook environment when you can actually speak to the graphic as well and have a dialogue with people afterwards. As you know, so often in Twitter, it's tough to have a meaningful exchange in just a few characters. So, no, it is a good graphic, though. I agree with you on that.
So that's going to do it for our tweets this week. And we'll jump right into our conversation with Mark here. And Mark, you have a great podcast. It's different from any of the other weather podcasts out there. Whenever I listen, I feel like I'm having a nice cozy fireside chat about the weather. And so I heard your first episode about how you got into weather and how it hooked you. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit of that story with our audience.
Sure, of course. So early in my youth, my family had moved from Nashville, Tennessee area down to Atlanta, Georgia, and this was in the early 70s. And in the winter of, I guess it was 72, 73, so early in 1973, Atlanta experienced a tremendous ice storm. And I was 6 at the time, and I still remember going to bed, and it was raining, and I was like, what's the big deal? My parents were concerned, and the next thing I know, I was getting woken up in the morning and moved downstairs, and the power was out and stuff. But when morning finally rose, you went outside, it was stunning. I mean, you were truly, I wasn't in the movie Frozen, but I may as well have been. So you get transported to this just completely other world, because so often people think of major winter events being these snow events, but everything was just coated in ice, and I'd never, it's just, you couldn't imagine such a place. I felt like I was Snow Miser in Burgermeister, Heat Miser, and Snow Miser stuff from old Christmas cartoons, but just as an incredible frozen sort of, it was like a winter wonderland, but it wasn't snow. I mean, so it was a really odd thing, because while my family had gotten snow, certainly some in the Tennessee area, I was so young that I didn't really have a memory of it. So this was that was the first real memory. And I still remember for years after that, generally speaking, Atlanta gets a lot of severe weather, and it didn't draw me in actively, I guess is the best way to think about it. But I still remember every winter, waiting to see if we would get a snow day and being disappointed when we only got a few flurries one year or stuff. But, Atlanta gets one of those events about every 10 years, and I've been fortunate enough to be a part of quite a few of them. And it's just, it's what sucked me in, even though it would be later in life when I would turn that meteorology bug into an actual career.
And so, where did you go from there? Just kind of briefly, because I think your path is different. I mean, everyone's path is unique, but I think yours is different, kind of in an extreme way. So I was just curious if you could talk about that.
Sure. So I guess growing up, while I had a aptitude in math and science, I'm probably more on the science end than the math end, which I don't think is all that odd for many meteorologists. I grew up in a family that was more business oriented, and even in a school or a community that it wasn't that they were discouraged. It's just I didn't have any role models to look to be encouraged by it. So, I had older brothers and parents, and they were all out in the business world. But the other bug that caught me fairly early on was, kind of the computer bug. And you got to remember, this was back in the day and age when the first Macintosh was being introduced. Back in the days when there were floppy drives and no hard drive, all the terminology that we're used to today has gone through many cycles by then. So what I ended up doing was going into kind of the business side of computers with my undergrad studies, as I mentioned at UGA. And for the first 15 years of my career, really, was focused in that world, and different aspects of it, from coming out of school and going to work for IBM, certainly a name everybody knows. But, I started with IBM when they were still making PCs, and that's what, the group I went to work for did. But this was back when personal computers could cost $10,000 or more, and then into the software, and then into the internet world. And while I love technology and still do today, I mean, I embrace it, and like talking about how it connects to weather on many different ways. I found myself, in terms of the industries that I was working to, just kind of leaving a void. And ultimately, my wife and I made a decision to go live in another country, and we were living in Santiago, Chile, and it was time to decide where I was going to work. And she encouraged me to really think about going back to school at that time. So I pondered it, and I did some refresher physics and calculus, and I'm not sure that my brain is still recovered from that event, but ultimately went back to Georgia Tech, and here we are today. So strong technology background that I still use, and again, that served me well in what I've continued to do in the weather enterprise. But at the same time, I'm able to do it in a field that I really love. So
yeah, I take from that. I take if you have a deep passion for something, and you already have a job, you got your undergrad degree, and you think you're good to go, but you feel that fire, and you want to pursue that, just do it. Go ahead and do it. It's worth it in the end. It like you said, you had to take some refresher physics and math classes, and that probably wasn't the most pleasant thing, but I think I'm assuming it was worth it in the long run.
Oh, for sure. You can't, with any of these things, and it gets back to the passion. I was thinking about it the other day, is while winter weather is really what drew me in, and that's kind of an odd thing for someone from the South to say, I also can look back and say, while I may not have been drawn by severe weather, I do remember that kind of blue sky days were not whatever isn't what appealed to me, right? So it was the the cloud changing days or the severe weather days that made me feel more at peace. So it was just a reminder to me that I do love what is all the things that we do about the weather. You know, the grass, the great variety, I guess, in what we study and what we do.
So if you haven't listened to Mark's podcast, it's What Is It About the Weather? You can find more info at whatisitabouttheweather.com, and it's on iTunes, and I'm assuming a variety of platforms. Mark, I'm curious, when did you decide to make this podcast, and why did you make the podcast?
I decided right after I listened to your guys' podcast. No, I'm just kidding. It's something that I had considered. You know, I got into, I guess, some of my first podcast listening was in grad school, right? Because some of the early people carrying iPods back in the day and that sort of stuff were into podcasting, and I had never really heard the term at that time. So back in the 2007, 2008 eras when I first started listening, and back then, you know, there weren't a lot, right? There were very specific topics, or they were done by big companies, but over time, more and more people started to get into it, and you realized that you didn't have to be a big media company, and you had to jump through a few hoops maybe to get it on iTunes or whatever, but it was feasible for anybody to do it. And that was one of the things that appealed to me. The other part about all this is, while during my technology career, you know, I had some client and public speaking facing aspects of it. During my meteorology work, it was all kind of behind the scenes. And so I guess I looked at podcast and said, yeah, and that's the thing. I'm a little bit introverted and all that, but I love talking about the topic. You know, you'll never see me shy away from it. But I also went and thought about what are other people doing. And as I was getting closer, I was at the AMS meeting last year, and if I remember correctly, you guys were there. Even you did a couple of episodes there.
Yeah.
And so it was from that, and you know, even at the beginning of last year, there weren't a lot of people doing it. Of course, you had the Weather Brains people of the world, right? And I guess the Carolina guys had been on there for a while, and some other people. But even like the Carolina group doesn't. I don't think they put their podcast on. It's just all YouTube. So when I was out there looking at iTunes and stuff, it was kind of like Weather Brains, and you guys had started. And the funny thing is you know, since then we've had a lot of other folks get into it, and I think it's great because I think we all do kind of different things, and we can all bring different angles and aspects to the table, but we can all do it, and podcasting such an easy way to share that experience that we think's interesting. And you know, you don't need 10,000 followers or 100,000 followers or listeners. You know, you get a few hundred, and or a few thousand, whatever it is, and you can be very happy that you know the people listening to you are hopefully appreciating what it is you do, right? So
yeah. So I want to interject there. First of all, that was a good one at the beginning. You got me going when you said after you listened to us. I was like, no way. But anyways, yeah. So I'm with you on it's great to see all the weather podcasts that exist now, because they fill their own gap. There's a market there for different weather podcast, because at first it was just it was Weather Brains was the first one. They've been around for since the late 2000s, early 2000s, something like that, mid 2000s maybe, and then the Carolina Weather Group had one, and they've been on for a while, and it was just those two for a long time, and then that's when I was like, hey Tyler, we should start something here. And right at that time, right as Tyler and I were starting, it just kind of exploded, and it seemed like everyone was, got the bug or realized that they could share their thoughts on the weather. And now we have Stormfront Freaks.
Yep.
Weather Hype. What's the one by Gabe? Behind the Storm is another one.
Yeah, and there's the guys that have done a tornado specific one.
Oh yeah, Tornado Talk.
Yep. And yeah. Hasn't Becky, I mean, I know you showed one of her tweets, hasn't she been involved with one with was it Ice Station? I know they're not regular in what they do. But there's some others, and that's one of the tricks is I know everybody, we won't necessarily see all these same podcasts, next month, much less next year. But people will come and go, hopefully. And again, it's one of those things where people will try it, and that's the thing. It's a low cost to kind of get off the ground. But as you were discussing, and I've done the same thing with Patreon, is to get on and, if people want to contribute and help defray some of the hard costs, that's great. I'm not going to neither one of us is going to probably get rich doing a podcast. But that's not why we do it per se. We do it, to share, and it is also an opportunity to get some experiences we wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and that sort of thing. But even getting a community and branching out to people that we may never have met otherwise. Yeah,
I agree. Becky is on a podcast called Ice Station Houseman, and she's also she helps us a little bit. We collaborate with her on our Weather Ready or Not series. So, anyways. So I guess so you've been doing this for how many months now have you been doing it?
Since I intentionally did my very first episode, the unedited version. So I did a dry run version on the leap day so that I could, have something unique to say that, my 1 year anniversary or my first anniversary won't be for 4 years. So if I'm still around doing it, then we will have achieved great things.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what have you learned thus far about maybe about yourself, maybe about the weather, maybe from your community? What have you learned since starting? What is it about the weather?
That's tough. I guess the bigger answer is what haven't I learned, but I'll try to start with, as with my podcast, and for those that aren't familiar with it, the focus is very much about, you guys talk about weather, right? Or Weather Brains or whoever else. There's plenty of people talking about the weather or speaking to the Met community or the Weather Enterprise community. And I tried to go a different angle with it in terms of trying to reach more of a public audience. At the same time, I do think it's an opportunity for even Mets out there to kind of reverse learn. We think about the weather all the time, and that's the focus of the podcast, is how does it relate to everyday life? And I think the interesting kind of things that I've learned going along have been twofold. Some of it I already covered, which is it's easy to kind of get into this if you want to. It's easy to try it, and you can try it even less painfully than getting on iTunes. You can do just YouTube to start for sure, and other. I mean, heck, you could just load some audio files on a web server, host it on WordPress.com, and throw it out there via tweet if that's what you want to do it. So, I've learned some aspects about taking advantage of the day that day and age in which we live in, and using the technology at hand. But it's also interesting. You're always surprised. I've had people that knew me in high school, and had no idea that I'd gone off and done this. And you come to find out that they have an interest in the weather. They may not be meteorologists or anything, but they enjoy the idea and this same concept of, kind of talking about it from a standpoint of, I don't need someone else to tell me it's 80 degrees today, but it's really kind of cool all the ways in which it touches me that I don't necessarily think about. And I guess that's what I like, is when I get show ideas from people, and you can tell that what the podcast has done for them is help them think about things from a different perspective in a new way. And they'll bring up things that maybe they had never really thought about, and throw ideas at me about, whether it's some of the ones where I look at historical events and the impact of weather, or, I know the one where I did the thing about umbrellas. I would have never thought about that episode, yet I had somebody make that suggestion. And that's always the tricky thing is will there be enough material to go do a whole episode? Of course, but those have probably been the biggest things, is the surprise of the people more than anything else, and from all walks of life that will come in and hear your podcast and offer different thoughts and different perspectives that you just may never have heard of. And that's weird for us, right? We think we know all these things about weather, but again, the whole idea of the podcast is as much for me to learn as it is for the audience to learn. So it gives me a chance to, in some ways, it's like going back to grad school class each episode and going and trying to, I don't want to be a fake news site, right? I want to be a real news information, but not in a formal way. But I do want to make sure it's well founded in what I'm talking about, and going and doing the research associated with that.
Yeah, I think you do a very good job with the research end of it. I was listening to the is pain and the weather associated with each other. And it sounds like you had to do a lot of reading for that because it brought in a whole different field of study. And shoot, what was the one? Oh, the Sharknado one. Is Sharknado possible?
Yeah.
That was a good one.
Well, to that end, to go out and find, Dennis Messerow, who did a whole write-up back when I guess the vein was still around, and I mean he had these graphics and everything showing all the tornado tracks and stuff. So he made my life easier. But yeah, you have to. I mean, I was stunned that when you really start thinking about the physics, to think about the thought that Sharknado really could happen, right? Yeah. I mean, for as much as we laughed at that movie, a tornado moving over could pick up a school of fish and move it, even sharks.
Yeah, I kind of knew what the final kind of conclusion was going to be, but it was really cool to hear you kind of pick apart the different aspects of it, and especially the difference between a water spout and the tornado. And from my perspective, you would need a pretty powerful tornado to go over water or start over water, to pick up a shark, especially a great white. But one thing I can't remember if you talked about it, and we're going off the tracks here, but is there how frequent are tornadoes where great whites would exist? That's outside of my kind of scope. But.
Yeah, I think, well, you could always argue that, I'm sure that whoever's doing Sharknado 5, there'll be an aquarium involved at the tornado.
Wait, they're on 5?
No. I'm just saying, whoever does it, but there have been 4, which,
oh my God.
Even when I was looking at it, because I haven't watched all of them, I had a hard enough time stomaching the first one.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. But it's one of those things where I think going and picking up mature great whites might be a little different than other ones. And great whites are probably less likely to happen than other schooling sharks.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if there happened to be a great white around, and yeah, to your point there, most of the places that great whites frequent are not the ideal tornado locations.
Yeah, this sounds like something Mythbusters should do, even though they're not on the air anymore. That sounds like a perfect thing for them to try out. Okay, so I have a kind of a big question for you here. What is it about the weather? Why does it fascinate and capture so many of us in kind of a deep way?
Yeah, it's interesting. And the funny thing is, I have to say that I think we in the U.S. have nothing compared to like folks in the U.K. And I think I'll do a future episode on kind of weather talk there, because it does seem that the things that can change on a dime and some of the terms they have that just make me laugh at going through it. But I think fundamentally there's 2 types of people, really. You've got the type that they're in some way they commute through weather every day or live in areas where the weather changes a lot. And you live in an area like that. It can be really hot, it can be really cold, and it's always kind of a common anchor you have with anybody. And I think that's where the underlying thing gets to is for Mets. I mean, we love all the nuances and, look at is that a shelf cloud or, is that a roll cloud coming in? Whatever it might be that other people, that don't really know all that terminology may just go, what are you talking about? But if we talk about it in terms of, oh, there were tornadoes, there's enough phraseology that's common to everybody that I had a family event after the tornado warning stuff in Atlanta. And even, with that group, that was even sometimes with family where you might feel certain topics like political topics can certainly get awkward. Weather for the most part doesn't come with that emotional bias. You don't have a perspective necessarily, unless unfortunately, of course, if you've been, severely impacted by a tornado event or something. But for the most people, it's that common anchor, and it gives us a chance to to start a conversation that we might not get into otherwise. So I think that's fundamentally where the kind of the what is it about the weather aspect comes from. Is it's just the common experience that you can also have and go to another place and hardly know the language or not know the language at all and share a common experience that you've experienced a million miles away. And in the same way, when it rains on you and it rains on this other person, it generally still feels the same, right? It's no matter whether they're poor or rich or whatever it is, we experience it the same way.
Yeah, sort of to that point, the first thing I think most people say when there's a kind of like a pause in the conversation or something is they talk about the weather. Got a couple inches of snow last night, or crazy weather it's been, stuff like that, just to kind of kick off the conversation, or it's something that that the person that you're trying to communicate with can knows about. They can relate to that because you can't avoid the weather unless you don't leave the house. But even
you can work at it, but it's not likely you're going to be successful.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So coming up on the 45-minute mark here, we ask this question to everyone that comes onto the show. And that is, what kind of advice would you give to someone up and coming, or maybe they're in the middle of their road and they're thinking about pursuing their passion in weather or meteorology or something like that? What kind of advice would you give them right now?
I think there's a few pieces in it. It speaks to my background, which is, one, it's never too late. I've met a lot of people that have gone back and done this later on in life, and there's no reason to think you can't. So that might be speaking to some people that once you get older, you're at a disadvantage to do all the math and science. And so it can be, daunting at times, but if you really love it, go for it. And if you really love it, the other thing, even to think about it as an undergrad, if you think, I want to go off and I'm not sure it's the right thing, but you love weather, it will make going to school easier, even if it's hard topics, and getting a more complicated degree will serve you well when you go out and start a career, even if you don't do it in weather. So if it's a field you love, at a topic you love even talking about, it will make getting through school that much easier. But all that said, when you're going through school, try to look for ways that you can branch out into other things. And, particularly in this day and age, the programming is a big piece of that, right? So, for some people, that's what it is. They get, into data, or they get into programming in some way. But it can also be the same. I mean, what Tyler wasn't able to join us, if I remember correctly, he's done like graphic design elements. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things when you look at what the weather enterprise is and all the different fields that it touches. When you're studying, you can get things that will apply in the weather enterprise to get a job in the weather enterprise, but it can also apply in a great many other fields, such that if you get out and say, well, I love weather, but I'm not sure I want to work at it, you can walk down a path and still do that. So, I think the answers are, if you really love it, go for it, and be thankful that you're doing something that you love, but don't shy away from broadening those experiences while you're pursuing it, so that it can be applied if you decide it's not what you want to do.
I love those words there. If you really love it, go for it. Those are kind of words to live by, if you ask me. So great advice there, Mark. And if you don't listen to Mark's podcast, it's called What Is It About the Weather? You can find more info at whatisitabouttheweather.com. And Mark, where can we find you on Twitter?
Yeah, so you mentioned the podcast webpage, but people can get me at Mark_Jelinek, and that's Jelinek. And both Twitter and Instagram are the same. And I do a lot of posting of weather photos and stuff as well. So even if you don't want to listen to the podcast and you want to get all your weather information from the Weather Junkies, that's fine. But you can reach me there. You can reach me there and follow me there for some cool pics and some weather related tweets and stuff like that from time to time.
Yeah, we don't recommend getting just your weather info from the Weather Junkies. If you don't listen to Mark, go ahead and give him a listen. You're going to come back, I know it, and follow him on Twitter and Instagram. Mark, thanks for joining the show tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been great.
And so now we plugged Mark's show. Let's plug our show here. If you don't follow us on Twitter, you can follow us at the WX Junkies. We're on Facebook. You can listen to this podcast on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and pretty much any podcast platform that you like. Give us a rating or review if you can. We really appreciate it. And we just launched our Patron at patron.com/theweatherjunkies. We'd really appreciate your help. But for now, that's going to do it for Mark and myself. We'll see you next week.